Guys, it's Dr. Moore, and today we're going to be talking about genetic disorders of sex. This is a topic I find really interesting, and we often hear about sex not necessarily being black and white, that there's these shades of gray in between. And I think learning more about these specific genetic disorders of sex also gives you a lot more information about where these shades of gray are in terms of how we think about sex, in terms of just the dichotomy of male and female, not necessarily being true. Now, before we get started, I want to talk about the terms genotype versus phenotype, because we're going to be using that quite a bit moving forward. So genotype is just a word that describes your genetic information. So in terms of sex chromosomes, you have two, they're either X or a Y. So you might have an XX or an XY. This would be your genotype. Your phenotype, on the other hand, is your physical manifestation. So this might be genitalia, whether you have a vagina or a penis. It also could be secondary sex characteristics that people assume you're male or female based on, like facial hair or breasts. So in a quote-unquote normal individual, if you're female, you will have two X chromosomes, and if you're male, you will have an XY chromosome. So if you can imagine, each parent usually donates one of their chromosomes to each of their children. Females only have X's to donate. So depending on whether the dad donates an X or a Y, depends what the gender or the sex of the child will be. Now you can have an abnormal number of chromosomes, and when you have an abnormal number, it's known as an aneuploidy. So one common aneuploidy is Down syndrome. In this case, individuals with Down syndrome have 3 chromosome 21s. However, aneuploidy can also occur in the sex chromosomes. So in that case, you may not have the normal pairs, either XX or XY present. We'll talk about different types of sex aneuploidy. There's really 4 main types. There's multiple additional combinations you could have, though. So in general, individuals who are phenotypically male and have sex aneuploidy either have Klinefelter syndrome, where they're XXY, meaning they have an extra X, Jacob syndrome, where they're XYY, meaning they have an extra Y, and then there could be some additional combinations of more than 3 sex chromosomes, which are increasingly rare. Now, in terms of people who are phenotypically female, if they have a sex aneuploidy, they may have a single X, so they're missing an X chromosome. This would be called Turner syndrome. Triple X, which is literally 3 X's, the females have an extra X, and then you might have multiple more X's than that. But again, increasingly rare. So what determines whether or not these sex aneuploidies look male or female? And that really comes down to the Y chromosome. So you'll notice all the phenotypically male disorders have a Y chromosome. All the phenotypically females lack that Y chromosome. So that's really sort of the male switch is on the Y chromosome. Now the first sex aneuploidy we'll talk about is Klinefelter syndrome. In Klinefelter syndrome, there's an XXY genotype, and this is prevalent in about 1 in 500 males. So I often like to think of sort of your average college campus in terms of getting an idea of prevalence. And if the average college campus has about 6,000 individuals, what that means is probably about half of them are male, 3,000, which means there's probably 6 men on every college campus with Klinefelter syndrome. Obviously, that's just a math problem. It may not be actually true, but that gives you an idea of sort of what the prevalence is like. This is actually one of the more prevalent sex aneuploidies. Now, because there's an extra X, which in general X is associated with feminine characteristics, men with Klinefelter may have more feminized body shape, so they may have narrower shoulders and wider hips. They also tend to be tall with long arms, which is not necessarily feminine characteristics, but other feminine characteristics they might have are slight breast development, sparse hair growth, such as pubic hair or facial hair, and they also may have testicular atrophy. They have infertility issues as well, and in fact, almost all sex aneuploidies will have at least some fertility issues because it's difficult for your cells to know exactly how to split those chromosomes up when it's used to pulling one chromosome into each gamete, and so all of these cause some infertility problems. Next type of disorder in terms of sex aneuploidies is Jacob syndrome. This is an XYY male, and again, whereas Klinefelter had an extra X and therefore extra feminizing features, Jacob syndrome has an extra Y, and so there's more masculine features. The prevalence here is about 1 in 1,000 males. So if we use our campus of 6,000, we would say 3,000 males, there'd be about 3 people with Jacob syndrome on campus. Now, because they have more male characteristics, they do tend to be more aggressive. And for a while, people might think that they were prone to criminality. Now, it's sort of borne out that it's not necessarily that they're more prone to criminality, but they do tend to have more aggression, especially as they're growing up and they don't have as much behavioral control as you do when you're an adult. They also tend to have some learning disabilities and some muscle problems in terms of low muscle tone and sometimes involuntary movement of their muscles. The other features you'll see is that they tend to be very tall, and they also tend to have acne, sometimes pretty severe acne. The first type of sex aneuploidy that is phenotypically female is Turner syndrome. And Turner syndrome is when one X is missing, so they only have one single X. The prevalence here is about 1 in 2,000 females. So you imagine your college campus of 6,000, 3,000 females. We would say 1 to 2 might have Turner syndrome. And keep in mind, all of these sort of college prevalence examples is assuming there's sort of average intelligence across the board. So it's not a perfect example. Now, in Turner syndrome, the main feature is that these people tend to have very small stature. Usually the average height is about 4'8". They also have a very wide torso, and that contributes to some heart defects. They may have a small intellectual disability. They are also infertile, and they also develop in a way that lacks secondary sex characteristics, such as breasts or pubic hairs, and so they always remain sort of a childlike appearance. Second type of aneuploidy of the sex chromosomes that looks phenotypically female is triple X syndrome. These females have an extra X. This is the same prevalence as Turner syndrome, so we're looking at 1 to 2 on a typical college campus. Individuals with triple X tend to be tall and have some weak muscle tone and cardiac problems overall. They may have underdeveloped sexual organs, breasts or ovaries, but in general, it's very hard to pinpoint these individuals based on appearance alone. Other than being tall, that's really the only symptom you might see, at least externally. Now, there are some conditions where there's more than 4 sex chromosomes. So I listed some of these earlier. So XXYY, XXXY, 5 X's. The more sex chromosomes you have, it means the more errors happened during cell division, and so they're much more rare. But in general, the more sex chromosomes you have, you tend to have an increased severity of symptoms. You tend to have more impaired growth and more intellectual impairment. So the more chromosomes, more problems. So now let's talk about this Y chromosome. Early on, we talked about how if there's a Y, people develop as phenotypically male, and that is almost always the case. So there is a gene on the Y chromosome known as the SRY gene, and you can think of this as sort of the switch. It's the first thing that tells the body to develop as male, as phenotypically male, because technically any child has the ability to develop as a male or a female. It's this gene that starts the chemical cascade, including testosterone, that leads to a fetus developing into a male. There's also other genes involved, but the SRY gene is probably the most prominent, and it happens to exist on that Y chromosome. Now that we've talked about Y meaning male, it's possible that that rule we've just established may not always be the case. So there are XX females that can appear phenotypically male, and there are XY males that can appear phenotypically female. This is rare, but usually it happens when there's a genetic error that occurs during one of the phases of cell division where there's crossover or recombination of different genes on different chromosomes. And sometimes that SRY gene can come to be located on an X chromosome, or other genes can switch chromosomes. And so, like I said, it's rare, but it can happen. So if you haven't already figured out by now, you cannot necessarily tell the genetic sex of someone just by looking at them. The way in which an XY male can look phenotypically female is something called androgen insensitivity syndrome. And this prevalence is around 1 in 35,000, so it's very rare. You would have to go to maybe 10 college campuses in order to find someone with androgen insensitivity syndrome. And the interesting thing about this syndrome is that usually the people don't know that they have it, and they develop fairly normally as a female. The only time you might find out you have this is if you realize you're infertile, you're trying to have children, and you go in for genetic testing and they see this, what it is a defect in the androgen receptor gene. And what that means is that the genetically male body, it's producing testosterone, but the body does not actually respond to the testosterone, and it doesn't signal the changes that testosterone normally signals. So what this means is that the testes usually are present in the abdomen. Sometimes they may even appear as a hernia. There is infertility. There is a vagina, but it's what's known as a blind vagina, so there's no uterus that can get pregnant. And that's usually the time that someone might realize something is wrong, is when they have chronic infertility problems. There may also, in some cases, be either what's known as a micropenis or a enlarged clitoris, and you can almost see that in this image, but it's what would have developed into a penis, but it just appears as a abnormally large clitoris. Hopefully after watching this video, you've really realized that there is much, much more than just male and female. And in fact, we would say abnormality is really normal. And I know I have shown you a lot of medical photos in this video, and sometimes it can feel as if we are placing these people on display. Remember, this is for educational purposes, so I also wanted to show you just a picture of some women at a conference for women with androgen insensitivity syndrome and other intersex conditions. So these are people you would know, like everyone else in your daily lives. You may never know that there's anything different about them. So just keep that in mind. These are conditions people live with all the time, and abnormality is pretty normal. I'll talk to you guys all next time. Bye.